Welcome, everyone. Have you ever noticed something interesting about learning? When people are young, learning new skills often feels natural. Children learn languages, games, and movements very quickly. They try many things. They make mistakes. And slowly, their abilities grow. But as people become adults, something changes in how they think about learning. Many adults begin to believe that learning new skills becomes harder with time. Some people even feel that after a certain age, the brain cannot change very much anymore. They may say things like, "I am too old to learn this," or "My brain does not work like it used to." This belief is very common, but modern psychology and neuroscience suggest something different. The human brain continues to change throughout life. Scientists use a word to describe this ability. They call it neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity simply means that the brain can reorganize itself. It can create new connections between neurons. It can strengthen certain pathways and slowly reduce others. In simple words, the brain adapts. And this adaptation happens every time a person learns something new. Learning a skill may look simple from the outside, but inside the brain, many small changes are happening. At the beginning of learning, the brain works very hard. When someone tries a new activity, the brain must process unfamiliar information. It must observe. It must remember instructions. It must coordinate movements or ideas. Because everything is new, the brain uses a large amount of attention. This is why beginners often feel slow or uncomfortable when learning a skill. The brain is still building its internal structure for that activity. For example, imagine someone learning to play a musical instrument. At first, every movement requires conscious effort. The person must think about where to place the fingers. They must think about rhythm. They must watch carefully and listen carefully. The brain is working intensely to organize these actions. But something interesting begins to happen with repetition. When the same actions are repeated many times, the brain starts to recognize patterns. Certain neural connections become stronger. Signals begin to travel more efficiently between areas of the brain. Movements become smoother. Decisions become faster. What once required a great deal of attention slowly becomes easier. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the brain creating shortcuts. But these shortcuts are not careless. They are the result of practice. The brain learns which connections are useful. Then it strengthens them. Over time, this process changes the physical structure of the brain. Certain areas become more specialized. Communication between regions becomes more efficient. This is one reason why experienced musicians, athletes, and craftsmen often perform actions that appear effortless. Their brains have been shaped by years of repetition. But an important detail is often misunderstood. These changes do not only happen in childhood, they continue throughout adulthood. Even in older age, the brain remains capable of forming new connections. The process may be slower than in childhood, but it does not stop. In fact, many studies show that adults who continue learning new skills often maintain strong cognitive abilities later in life. Learning creates activity inside the brain, and activity helps the brain stay flexible. Without stimulation, certain neural pathways become weaker. But when the brain is regularly challenged, it continues adapting. This is similar to how the body responds to physical movement. Muscles that are used regularly become stronger. Muscles that are not used slowly lose strength. the brain works in a similar way. When people practice thinking, remembering, or solving problems, the brain remains active. And over time, this activity shapes how the brain functions. However, learning new skills is not only a biological process, it also involves emotions and expectations. Many adults hesitate to begin learning something unfamiliar, not because the brain cannot learn, but because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. When people are beginners, they must face mistakes. They must accept that they are slow at first. For some adults, this experience feels difficult. Modern culture often encourages people to appear competent and confident. But learning requires the opposite. Learning requires patience with imperfection. At the beginning, progress is rarely visible. The brain is still building its internal network. Changes are happening quietly, but they are not immediately noticeable. This stage can feel discouraging. Yet something important is happening beneath the surface. Each repetition slightly strengthens the neural connections involved in the activity. Each attempt helps the brain recognize patterns. Each small correction improves the brain's understanding of the task. Over time, these tiny changes accumulate. What once felt difficult slowly becomes manageable. And eventually, it may even become natural. This gradual transformation is one of the most remarkable abilities of the human brain. It shows that learning is not only about acquiring knowledge, it is about reshaping the brain itself. But modern life introduces an interesting complication. Today, people are surrounded by constant stimulation. Information appears continuously. Messages arrive. Notifications interrupt attention. New content appears every few seconds. Because of this environment, attention often becomes fragmented. People move quickly from one activity to another, and deep repetition becomes less common. However, skill development depends heavily on repetition. The brain needs time and focus to strengthen its connections. When attention constantly shifts, the brain receives only brief exposure to many activities, but it rarely spends enough time developing mastery in one area. This may explain why many people feel that they are learning many things, but mastering very few. The brain begins many processes, but it rarely completes the deeper stages of learning. Skill development requires something different. It requires sustained attention. It requires returning to the same activity repeatedly, not for minutes, but for weeks, months, or years. At first, progress may feel slow, but gradually, the brain begins to reorganize itself around the skill. And this transformation produces an interesting psychological effect. As people improve, their relationship with the activity changes. What once felt difficult begins to feel familiar. The brain no longer experiences the same level of uncertainty. Confidence appears naturally, not because the person decided to feel confident, but because the brain now understands the patterns involved. Confidence often grows from familiarity. The more the brain recognizes a situation, the calmer it becomes. This is why experienced professionals often appear relaxed in situations that would feel stressful to beginners. Their brains have already built the necessary structures to handle the task. But the benefits of learning new skills go beyond performance. They also influence how people experience daily life. When the brain learns something new, it becomes more attentive to patterns. It becomes curious. It notices small details. This heightened awareness can change how ordinary experiences feel. For example, someone who learns photography begins to notice light in a different way. They observe shadows, colors, and composition. A musician may hear subtle variations in sound. A cook may notice flavors and textures more carefully. Learning expands perception. The brain becomes sensitive to aspects of the world that were previously invisible. In this sense, developing a skill does not only change what a person can do, it also changes what they can notice. And noticing more of the world often creates a deeper sense of engagement with life. Daily experiences feel richer. Ordinary moments contain more detail. But there is another subtle effect of skill development that is rarely discussed. Learning new skills also changes how people experience time. When someone practices a skill regularly, progress unfolds slowly. Improvement cannot be rushed. It appears gradually through repetition. This rhythm encourages patience. The brain learns to accept slow development. Instead of expecting immediate results, the mind becomes comfortable with gradual change. In modern life, many processes feel immediate. Messages travel instantly. Information appears quickly. Entertainment is available at any moment. But skill development follows a different rhythm. It unfolds quietly over long periods. This slower rhythm can feel unusual at first, but many people eventually discover that it creates a sense of stability. When progress happens slowly but consistently, it becomes reliable. The brain begins to trust the process. This trust reduces the pressure to achieve immediate results. Instead, attention shifts toward steady improvement. Over time, the brain adapts not only to the skill itself, but also to this slower pace of development. And this may explain something interesting about people who continue learning throughout their lives. They often appear mentally flexible, curious, engaged with the world, because their brains remain active in the process of adaptation. Each new skill introduces new patterns, new connections, new perspectives, and the brain continues reorganizing itself in response. Learning becomes part of how the mind experiences life, not a temporary activity, but an ongoing process. However, the most interesting change may not occur in the brain structure. It may occur in how people think about their own abilities. When someone begins learning a new skill, uncertainty is high. The outcome is unknown. The brain is cautious. But as learning progresses, something subtle changes. The person begins to understand how improvement happens. They see that ability is not fixed. It evolves through practice. This realization can quietly change a person's relationship with difficulty. Challenges no longer appear as barriers. They appear as stages of learning. And this shift in perspective influences many areas of life. Because once the brain understands that improvement is possible, it becomes less afraid of unfamiliar experiences. Learning reveals something important about human potential. But perhaps the most meaningful insight is simpler. When people learn new skills over time, the brain slowly changes. Connections strengthen. Patterns become familiar. Abilities expand. Yet the most interesting transformation may not be the skill itself. It may be the quiet discovery that the mind is more adaptable than it first appeared. And sometimes, simply realizing that the brain can still change is enough to make the world feel slightly more open than it did before.